All right, so we'll come at the second meeting of our fall seminar, History of Scholarship and the Global Imagination, which we are coordinating together with Stefano Gulizia. And in fact, it is a kind of cooperation of Turin with Prague. And of course, you all know that this is the seminar organized by Scientiae, by our group, in cooperation with the Institute of Philosophy, Czech Academy of Sciences in Prague. Our plan is to continue each week on Monday at 4:30 Central European Time until the 16th of December, the week before Christmas. We will have 13 presenters, if I'm correct. And each seminar is planned roughly for 1 hour, but if this is needed, we can continue extra 15 minutes or 20 minutes or so. Each presentation is about 35-40 minutes, and it is followed by discussion. So it is my great pleasure to introduce today our speaker, Sergio Orozco-Echeverri. Sergio is a professor of history and philosophy of science from the Institute of Philosophy at the Universidad de Antioquia in Colombia. He's also fellow of the Royal Historical Society and associated professor at the Institut für Politikwissenschaft und Ideengeschichte at Justus Liebig Universität Gießen in Germany. And after several important fellowships in Edinburgh, Renaissance Society of America and Royal Society of London, he is currently Francis Yates Fellow at the Warburg Institute. He's also member of our executive committee of Scientiae, and we are very proud to have it in the executive committee, have him in the executive committee. Sergio studied philosophy and physics, and he earned his PhD in science and technology studies at the University of Edinburgh. Currently, he is also a PI of the research project called The Cosmology of Iberian-American Repertorios de los Tiempos, which is a project funded by Universidad de Antioquia, his mother university, the Renaissance Society of America, and the Royal Society of London. This project traces and explains the production, circulation, and uses of knowledge of the heavens in early modern Iberian America, and includes historical analysis, philosophical discussion of the subject, and digital humanities. Sergio published widely in such outstanding journals as Annals of Science, History of Science, Early Science and Medicine, and other journals. And he is currently preparing his monograph to be published in Rome in 2025. Its title will be The New World and the Reinvention of Experience, Production and Circulation of Knowledge in Colonial Spanish America. Today, Sergio is going to present his paper on the fascinating topic called Astrology, Almanacs, and the Global Shift from Flat Charts to Spherical Maps in Early Modern Ibero-America. Sergio, floor is yours, and we are all looking forward to your presentation.
Well, thank you very much, Vladimir, for this very generous presentation, and thanks everyone. And apologies for the delay. As probably you know, we are experiencing a rebirth here, and that rebirth implies sometimes that things are being fixed last minute here and there. But things are going fine. So thanks for that. What I'm going to present today to you, it's part of a work I'm currently doing. It's an aspect I'm exploring. It may be a lot of information. I'm going to go over some background that I think is necessary to put the argument in context, and then I'm going to move exactly right to the argument I want to make today. But if you find this a bit too much, and then you can write down whatever you want me to talk more in the questions moment. So there's a very, very simple idea that I want to present today, and is the idea that there's a big change in the conception of space related to the navigation, both Portuguese and Castilian navigation in the 15th century. And that idea of a spherical Earth impacts all the areas of knowledge and what I think are knowledge-based practices like astrology and astronomy and medicine. And we can track those changes that have, in my perspective, a very, very deep consequence and a very, very deep change and transformation, both in the genre of writing I'm interested in, but also in the practices related to that. So what I wanted to show you, and I think I have the evidence for that, is that local almanacs that were calculated or reckoned for a specific location, when they become part of this global network of knowledge and conception of a space that goes beyond what is known to explore what is unknown, it implies an evolution and a big transformation of almanacs, and they produce a genre that I find unique, and I think it's very, very singular, that moves globally and takes evidence from very different locations. But for understanding that, for showing that, how this practice of astrology as represented in these almanacs, I'm gonna make a quick background to two aspects related to this change of flat chart to spherical representations. When we talk about charts, we're talking about representations that have a purpose, a very, very particular purpose, in this case, navigation. As a guide to navigation, as a record of the experience of navigators, flat charts that were mostly produced for the Mediterranean navigation from the 13th century to 15th century, probably earlier, they assume a flat representation of Earth because they do not want to represent the Earth, but the experience of pilots navigated with compass. And that's kind of like the kind of Portolan charts we're probably very used to seeing. And here is a very famous one where you can see, for example, the traces on the rhombs. Anyway, what is important here is that by the 15th century, when Portuguese got interested in navigating the coast of Africa, trying to find a route to India, they introduced astronomical navigation. What that means, the bringing on board astronomical instruments, simplifying them, and using them to calculate latitude and distances, not based on the compass, but based on the observation of stars. In so doing, we move from Portolan charts that depict magnetic rhombs to very different kind of representations. And these representations, because they include latitude, are spherical representations. So here we have a famous one that is the so-called Cantino representation, or Cantino planisphere, that was produced in Portugal and is one of the first representing the coast of Brazil and the line of Tordesillas. I'm going to talk about that in a second. But the central point here is that we move for a representation of magnetic compass and rhombs, and so to speak, the experience of the pilot, to an attempt to chart, observe, and measure latitudes by pilots using astronomical instruments. This had all kind of troubles and technical problems, but imprecisions, errors that were very important. But the point here is that this change, it's very, very important for the representation. This is the technical aspect. But this technical aspect is the consequence of a political change that I want to bring up quickly here. And it's like when Portuguese start sailing to the south and Spaniards as well to the Canary Island, there is a clash of powers in navigation, and there is a first agreement in 1479 called the Treaty of Alcázar Toledo, where Spaniards and Castilians and Portuguese divide a line, an horizontal line, let's say a latitudinal line, saying Portuguese can explore from Cape Verde down, and Spaniards can navigate the rest. So in a sense, Spaniards lost the right to navigate to the south of Cape Verde, but they gained the chance to explore west without any limitation. When Columbus first arrived in the in Iberian Peninsula after his first voyage in the Americas, he returned to Lisbon, and this is a very important aspect. And the King of Portugal thought that Columbus has discovered lands that belong to him. And there was a massive political conflict that was solved partially in the Treaty of Tordesillas. So tried to establish a line dividing the territories between the Americas, between Spain and Portugal. Yeah. The problem here is that it sounds very easy, but the wording of the treaties and also the technical difficulties in setting up a line dividing a territory that should be 100 leagues or 370 leagues west from Cape Verde, measure where, how to trace that line, etc. That was a very, very important problem. But in principle, there was no need to trace a line, but there was an orientation that was used for the navigation. The problem emerged again in the 1520s with the Magellan-Elcano expedition, the circumnavigation. That was, remember that Magellan is Portuguese, but he was working for the crown of Castile, circumnavigated. And in so doing, the calculation showed many important things, but one of those is that the sphericity of Earth became a reality. And that implied that Tordesillas meridian implied an anti-meridian, a line on the other side, on the other hemisphere, to divide or to settle the rights of navigation on the other side. So that implied an attempt again between Portuguese and Castilian between 1520s and 1529 to renegotiate the terms of the original treaties and produce then a full line. And the hot point here was the Moluccas Island, that was the Spice Islands that Spaniards claim fall into their territory, which clearly not. And Portuguese had the knowledge, so to speak, to claim that was not the case, but not the means to prove that. In 1524, there are important attempts to solve this problem. But what is interesting to me of this case of 1524 is that in trying to solve the problem of an anti-meridian, there's a debate on what is the right way to represent the Earth in terms of navigation, a flat chart of a spherical representation. This initial attempt to solve the problem was not successful, and it led to further negotiation in 1529 that were involving other bigger political aspects like marriages, and that made the problem less serious. But the outcome by 1529, in the last treaties of the period dealing with the matter and establishing the anti-meridian, is that there was a primacy of the spherical representation. That spherical representation containing latitudes observed by pilots and sailors during navigation. And in that sense, there was a way to charter what was unknown. This is a bit of a summary of a visual representation. We have in 26 parallel the 1479 Alcázar Toledo line that dividing originally the treaties of navigation. We can see that clearly, for example, the Caribbean island that Columbus landed at the very beginning were under Portuguese jurisdiction, so to speak, if we extend the line. And then we have the first, in green, we have the first Tordesillas line with the proper anti-meridian on the Pacific Ocean. And then we have the second, 1494, with the subsequent anti-meridian that clearly shows that Moluccas Islands are on the Portuguese side, but also the Philippines. The whole point here is that the spherical representation of Earth that was won basically by this chart that was produced by a Portuguese cartographer, Diego Ribeiro, was so accurate and contained so many elements that provided the impression that the Moluccas Islands were on the side of the Spaniards, and this was central to settle the dispute. The whole point here, anyway, is that this is a spherical representation that gave the impression that accuracy was higher in a more, so to speak, reliable representation of land masses and distances in a spherical way rather than the flat charts. This is a very, very beautiful and also very complex representation. I'm not going to go over the details because it includes some instruments used for astronomical navigation. We find an astrolabe, for example, etc. Long story short, and quoting Antonio Sanchez, he says, we can say that in a few decades in this period, the economy became mundus, a totality empirically tested by seafarers. So a notable change between the treatises of Alcázabal in 1479 and Zaragoza in 1529 was the conception of the Earth on which geographic and navigational findings were represented. While this may sound like a simple transition from A to B, the path leading from flat nautical charts to spherical geographic maps involved political confrontations and negotiations, commercial interest in conflict, technical challenges, and clashes between groups of experts in navigation, geometry, and diplomacy. Several Spanish and Portuguese scholars have contributed to our understanding of the political, epistemological, and technical layers involved in the disputes between Castile and Portugal concerning boundaries and how, in the words of Antonio Sanchez, the construction of, and I quote, a global and geographical coherent depiction of the Earth, that's the end of the quote, informed by the evidence gathered in the oceanic voyages, contributed not only to the history of cartography, but also to the history of science at large. Thanks to this body of scholarship, we now understand that a central aspect of the controversy surrounding this transition was the incompatibility between the cartographic models of geographical maps and nautical charts. This incompatibility was technical, as it involved conflicting representation of what was presumed to be the same object. It was epistemological, as it encompassed different views on accuracy, in the sense of what constitute an accurate chart of map. And let's say the incompatibility was dispositional, because nautical charts and geographic maps were objects embedded within dissimilar sets of specific practices like navigation, calculation, diplomacy, etc., sometimes with incompatible goals. By the time of the Treaty of Zaragoza in 1529, maps and charts representing a global Earth, integrating land masses and seas, incorporated a robust visual apparatus expected to attest to their accuracy. The emergence of a global image of the world as materialized in the Treaty of Zaragoza and further developed by cosmographers and cartographers not only influenced the disputes and settlements between Castile and Portugal's commercial, political, and geographical interests, but was also reflected in other knowledge-based practices where representation of the world were involved. In this paper, I explore the emergence of this global image of the world through the evolution of Iberian almanacs and the conception of place and space underpinning this shift. In contrast to other European tradition of practical astrology and calendars, early modern Spanish almanacs began to broaden their scope by presenting tables, calculations, and rules as transferable or at very least adaptable to locations other than that were initially devised. And while this trend appeared in the late 15th century almanacs, where such a transference did not involve significant change in latitude, and thus it had little impact on astrology, medicine, and meteorology, oceanic voyages opened the door to accounting for more distant and positionally complex locations. Also, they brought news on other climates, foods, plants, and animals. As a result, the introduction of a global image of the world and the possibility of transferring calculations to more remote and positionally varied location ended up in a reorganization of the genre. So this is what I want to show you today. The very first example of a local almanac. We can say the kind of almanac from which the others evolved. This almanac, it's very important because it was very influential, and we're going to see it in a minute. Then I'm going to show you how almanacs began to be transferable. You know, how can you reuse the tables for different locations without any significant change in latitude? But then in the third, we're going to see how significant changes in latitude introduce challenges, not only in terms of computational astronomy and rules of transference and calculation, but also in the kind of astrological, meteorological, medical, and agricultural information that an almanac like this should have. Long story short, if an almanac can be used everywhere on Earth, we cannot have agricultural information for the Iberian Peninsula only, or for latitude north, or for the torrid zone. We need to think about almanacs that can provide information for, in theory, any location. But it cannot be a summary of all the theory, because almanacs are supposed to be practical guides. So the selection of topics that should be included in global almanacs reveal a lot about this transformation of knowledge. This has an impact not only in Iberian almanacs, in the way that Iberian almanacs are read, imitated, reproduced, and transformed in the Americas. I'm going to show some examples, and then I show some perspectives of this. So let's start with the early modern local almanacs. The one I'm interested in, or the one that started the story in the Iberian Peninsula, is, as in many other cases, connected with the introduction of the printing press during the second half of the 15th century. In contrast with other European location almanacs, Latin calendars, and ephemerides were already in high demand in Spain when printers started to publish first yearly almanacs by the 1470s. Astrological literacy associated with the growing interest in studying and translating Greek and Arabic sources was relatively high in Spain and achieved some visibility through institutionalization in universities. We have a chair of astrology in Salamanca, for example, from 1460, to which intellectual circles is associated the Almanac Perpetuum by Abraham Zacuto, for example, that was translated into Castilian by the chair of astrology, Juan de Salaya, whose son is very important to the story that I'm going to tell. These printed almanacs, among these printed almanacs, the so-called Lunari by Bernard de Granolac holds a central position. It was first printed in Naples in 1485, initially circulated in Catalan and Latin, but it was quickly translated into Florentinian, Venetian, Tuscanian, Portuguese, Castilian, and French. And as it was common in medieval and early modern European almanacs, this one was based on a lunar cycle from which a 19-year solar cycle was established. And the cycle set the parameters for calculating movable feast, as well as addressing some general points of interest related to medical astrology and agriculture. The Lunari provided, this is one of the typical pages of the Lunari, tables of the position of the moon, eclipses, basic calendric information in a 30-folio print covering the years from 1485 to 1550. In a rather slim format, anyone interested in the basic celestial positions could have an almanac that will last for his or her entire life. Calculated for Barcelona, Granolac Lunari offered a more comprehensive and at the same time portable set of tables with short instructions on what is contained and fundamental operations aspects, such as the day starts at noon, an hour has 60 points, and the usual date for the change of season or quattro temporas, etc. The Lunari became highly influential once it was made technically portable, as I will explain shortly. However, the initial Catalan edition provided computation for a specific location, in this case, Barcelona. This meant that most Lunari users were near Barcelona or close enough for the parameters to work within a reasonable margin. Accuracy was highly relative to the interests and activities of the users of Almanac, and given the broad range of activities associated with Lunaris, it is unsurprising that a local almanac generally suffices. Greater precision was required for tasks such as the casting a horoscope, where hours and minutes could make a difference, than for determining the right moment to harvest olive trees or vineyards, where a margin of several days may not significantly affect the outcome. Subsequent reprints, like the one we see on the screen, of granulae by the late 15th century included the extension of the calculations of the lunary to 17 locations other than Barcelona, all in Italy. As in many other aspects, this seems to be an editorial decision extending the range of the lunary to the Italian market of ephemeral and practical astrological literature. For doing so, at the end of the yearly calculations, a table indicating how many hours and minutes should be added for the calculation to be used in other location was introduced, including some basic instructions, that is the ones we see in the screen. Here we see, you know, how it is. I'm gonna skip a few representations here, but anyway. What is interesting is that by 1495, Andres Delí reproduced the Granulac Almanac in what he called the Repertorio de los Tiempos, a genre that included an enlargement of information, particularly on theoretical aspects that could provide a deeper sense of what was implied in the calculations. So we find, for example, more complex definitions of the unit of measurement, like day, year, month, and their divisions. We find characterizations of months, heaven and celestial bodies. We find a characterization of the signs or constellations and their corresponding planets. And we find, which is very important for our case, at the end of every month, we find a short notice of agricultural and medical remarks for that month. Keep in mind that this is calculated for Barcelona. So agriculture and medical remarks correspond to rather cold, for example, in this case, that is January, rather cold winters and a specific location and latitude. And we find here also the case of the zodiac months that are represented. This is the map where we find the basic places where this can be transferred. We have also that there is absolute no mention to latitude or to place. The entire transference system is based on a conception of almanac as a regulation of time and the use of tables in other times, we will call them time zones, but this is our conception. They're talking about time in terms of hours and minutes, hours and points. So we find the table reference here with the days, hours, points, signs, and degrees, but these degrees represent the point where, or the degree of the zodiac where a specific celestial event will happen. By 1524, and this is very important, the success of the Delí's Repertorio was massive, and it was reproduced, copied in the black market. It was sold everywhere, to the point that Sancho de Zelaya, who was the chair of astrology in Salamanca, applied for an imperial printing license and calculated an entirely new repertorio as an attempt to correct the problem already mentioned, the problem that tables were poorly calculated. This correction encompassed the introduction of elements from cosmography, arithmetic, and some procedures to produce basic calculations concerning time, seasons, and latitude. These include also theoretical representation of basic instruments to calculate time and latitude. So this is the title page. Is a very, very important mathematician in the history of early modern Spain. He was chair of astrology between 1504 and 1542, but he was also a physician to the Council of the Inquisition. So he was very close to Queen Isabella of Castile, but also then to Charles V, the King Emperor. What is different in Sancho Repertorio is that there is an emphasis on medical astrology and the concern that the precision should involve a geographic reference that allowed to calculate with precision the latitude. So there is not only a difference in time, but there's also a difference in location. This location is not exactly a conception of a space, but it's a conception of place where the celestial phenomena are observed from the Earth and the influence they have on that specific location. I'm not going to translate the whole quotation, but he complains that the Delhi lunario that is commonly printed is very, very mistaken, and that the mistake can be so big that, in his view, the smallest mistake is around 20 hours and 17 minutes. And he said it is the poor doctor, the poor physician, thinks that he is sending the patient to bleed or to purge one day after the conjunction or the opposition. And because of this, I was moved to amend these books and to put the conjunctions and oppositions truly in the day and minute in which they should be. And this is what I think is the key element. And he says, and because at the time of the conjunction and opposition is not all in the same place. The Spanish is also awkward, yeah. It says the conjunction as opposition is not all at the same time in the same place. Because even if it's the same time when the conjunction is here, or the full moon in this same moment in Rome or in Jerusalem or in the Indies, it is not at the same time. So if the conjunction, for example, in Toledo at 1 after noon, in Rome, it will be at 2 and 1/3 afternoon, and that will be in the same instant. So there is a difference between instant and measured time. What is central here is that he conceives that the transportation of knowledge should include not only time, but latitude. And we can see here, for the first time in a repertorio, the introduction of latitude in degrees on the column on the hand right side, including how it should be measured and some instruments to calculate latitude in case it cannot be determined concerning the city or the place where it's supposed to be. I think this is a central aspect to understand or to see the conception how time, and particularly time of almanacs, is connected with place. We find then, I'm going to show quickly 2 examples of global almanacs. The global almanacs, Jerónimo de Chávez, who was son of a major pilot and first lecturer on cosmography at the House of Trade, published in 1548 a reform repertorio. But in 1545, he had produced a translation and commentary to Sacrobosco's sphere, which already enlarged the boundaries of the work presented in the sphere through commentaries. These changes involve a reworking of the theory of the elements in order to explain how the Earth is formed by water and earth. The geographic singularities of the Earth, that is the idea that is formed by land masses and oceans, appears recurrently not only in the commentary to Sacrobosco's idea on elements and gravity, but also in the visual apparatus, where the rich illustrative tradition of Sacrobosco meets geographic representation of the Earth, including the Americas, like the one we have here. What do we have then in what is different from this repertory? It's an attempt to put in order literature on time, dealing with practical activities. There's a major recalculation of tables, eclipses offering astronomical, cosmographical, and geographic locations. This recomposition is calculated not for a single location, as we can see, as I'm going to show you in a second, but for a global world. And he uses a system of coordinates that he calls a meridian and a horizon. In order to do so, he introduces elements of spherical geometry to provide mathematical elements for the readers to be able to understand a mathematical conception of a spherical space, including meridians, or what we call also what we will call today parallels, or different kind of segmentations to make sense of how to calculate latitude and all positional measurements. This included, for example, the superposition of an abstract spherical Earth, and at the same time, a geographically richer representation of the terraqueous globe that began to include, like in the case that we see in the screen now, the 12 winds, and we see they're blowing over the American continent, where we can see the Andes, the Amazon River, river plates, different islands, and we can see even in North Africa, the Atlas Mountains, and all kind of different representations. So the point here, I think, is that we have a more sophisticated spherical Earth, and at the same time, a geographically more complex representation of the Earth that meet together. This begins to gather together, for example, in the calculation of the canicular days or specific days for medical practice that are particularly hot and then should be of attention in different locations. So we begin to see how they were calculated for different locations. At the same time, he begins to show how, for example, medical theory, agriculture, calendrics, meteorology are different in different latitudes. So we have a fourth book on what he called La mudanza de los tiempos, the change of time. And then we have attempts to understand how in different attempts to approach climatic theory, there are variations of environmental conditions we will call today, such as rain, clouds, etc., in different latitudes. I'm not going to go over this aspect, but I want to show you here that we moved from 17 cities to 261 in this case, that included a wider range of latitudes that implied then more challenges. In the 1580s, there is a boom of repertorios given three aspects: the Gregorian reform, the celestial novelties, the comets and novae, and also by the 1580s, there's a better knowledge of the Atlantic. This involved the remaking of repertorios because all the calculated with the Julian with the Julian calendar became obsolete. But this also gave chance to produce a new set of repertorios. The most interesting one that I'm going to go over it rather quickly because I'm running out of time is the Cronología o Razón de los Tiempos by Rodrigo Zamorano, who was also pilot mayor and mayor cosmographer of the House of Trade. In a similar way to Chavez, but in a more sophisticated and complex mathematical way, Zamorano was translator of Euclid. He defined times and all it measured as connected with the observed motion of celestial bodies from a place on Earth. So this is the starting point from which he confectionates the entire new repertorio. And then we can see the introduction of more sophisticated elements, such as the Theorica Planetarium in the visual apparatuses, to provide even more sophisticated elements of spherical knowledge in this case. We find at the same time an evolution in the geographic representation and description of the geographies of the New World, including locations and the correlations of plants, animals, and minerals. Similarly, we see a more complex conception of the winds that involve now not only the winds of the traditional geography, but also the winds of navigation that are 36 and are presented here according to the model of the compass or the navigational compass that he represents on the right-hand side. At the same time, we have a very important aspect in Spanish conception of knowledge, that is that eclipses can be observed from different places. This is an idea that we have since Ptolemy, but Spaniards used to calculate difference in longitude to trace the maps of and establish the distances, for example, initially between Mexico City and Madrid. And similarly, there's an expedition to observe eclipses all around the New World to establish a new set of longitudes. Instructions for doing so and to observe and calculate eclipses and the time that eclipses occur are provided now in repertorios. In this case, we have a 308 table of latitudes and longitudes. In this case, latitude is presented first on time, suggesting that it's a more important parameter for understanding the difference between locations more than longitude or more than difference in the parallels. Similarly, there's a more complex and developed section on meteorology and medicine called again La mudanza de los tiempos. And in this case, there's a more complex correlation between time as a measurement of time and time as an environment or as the immediate surrounding context in which body develops, interacts, and finally perish. Although I say here it's not useful for sea navigation, we have evidence of pilots taking almanacs all over the globe to use them in different locations for setting parameters where they landed on the other side. In the case, I'm going to just show two examples of American integration of how, for example, both Chavez and Zamorano were widely read and smuggled because of the censorship of judicial astrology in the 17th century. But as they travel all over the New World, they provided to locals the idea of a unified world in an abstract mathematical way through spherical geometry, sorry. And then using this element, locals began to calculate the parameters they needed and the selection of natural, philosophical, meteorological, and medical elements that were of their interest. It is a visual representation of several cross-sections relying on spherical geometry, all of these of repertorios of the New World. The first one is a Mayan case, the second one is in Mexico City, and the third one is in New Granada, where we can see on top kind of like a spherical cross-section, and in the second one, a traditional division between horizontal and vertical meridians in spherical geometry. That also provide an aspect that I wanted to leave out a bit here for much of time. There is an idea of a linear conception of time as a synchronization of time. This was very important in the New World because it provided the chance for locals, both indigenous but also mestizos, to introduce pre-Hispanic histories into a trend of universal history. At the same time, repertorios provided the tools to trace new maps, new stars, and to explore the new meanings. For example, in the first we see Aztec, in the second one we see New Granada or current Colombia, and in the third one we see famous Enrico Martin's attempt to understand the signs of New Spain or Mexico. These also involve reflections on how body will be changed in different locations by the specific time of food or the non-natural that will change. We can talk more about this if you have any questions on these details, but to wrap up, the construction of the argument, local almanac usable in one location because becomes transferable in different latitude with no significant change of latitude. Thanks to the oceanic voyages, latitude becomes a central reference to understanding locations and distances, and this has an impact both on medical and meteorological theory that leads to an organization of time in connection with place and space. And this involved the introduction of full doctrines to provide elements to provide diagnosis and prognosis in different locations. Finally, there's a reflection I want to put in the end that is something I've been working on and is an attempt to understand if these almanacs represent a global world, how they were exactly used by astrologers and physicians that now became travelers and that were using not settle a practice in a location, but were moving all around different latitudes and altitudes. And there's what I think is a very interesting interplay between an abstract spherical geometry that provides unifying set of tools and an adaptation by geography and chorography to local circumstances to interpret using this spherical geometry, local circumstances to understand changes and influences in a world that was constantly changing. Thank you very much for this.
Okay, thank you so much, Sergio, for this very rich and very fascinating paper, which showed us this history of the development of Ibero-American almanacs, Iberian and Ibero-American almanacs, in fact, from this concept of local almanacs to the concept of global almanacs. And you put nicely the whole story to this very complex sort of context of the of the development of various visual representations of geographical data in connection with the political developments, which was very important as well. So I would like to open the discussion, the remarks, comments, etc., etc. So floor is open for discussion. Andre.
Thank you very much. That was a very rich and detailed talk, as you indicated at the beginning. I have a very general question. The examples that you used suggested that as it was applied to astrology, for the most part, the emphasis seems to have been on what is sometimes called natural astrology, general astrology, revolutions, and not nativities, interrogations, or elections. And my question is that a function of the selection that you made, or is that also reflected in the way that the geographical novelties were used for astrology? That is, the emphasis was almost entirely on natural astrology.
Thank you very much. That's a very good question, Andre. I think you find mostly natural astrology, and this is what is more prominent. But you also find judicial astrology, and you're gonna find some uses of judicial astrology being really, really important in settling the new world. And you have very interesting examples of conquistadors trying to use almanacs to establish what is the right day to settle a new city, to find what is the right astrological, which is tied to a religious calendar, of course, influence. And sometimes some cities, for example, the case of Lima is paradigmatic of this in 1531, that the foundation was delayed to wait for being founded on the day of Epiphany to get the right influence. So you have both aspects, and in the form of religious calendar, there is also an overlapping judicial astrology that is happening here in many aspects to find what is the right astrological influence that is usually publicly presented as a religious festivity, but it's usually related to convening astrological influences. So, for example, in the case of elections, you find also a lot of conquistadors using almanacs to start an expedition and say, is it the right time to move, or shall we stay longer? Shall we stay here? And you find in many cases both that they are trying to understand if it's a humid period, if it's a rain period, but also if it's the right astrological moment. There are 2 or 3 cases very important related to comets and repertorios with the evolution over the 16th century enlarged the information on comets. And this is important because in the 1570s, that's the topic in Europe, but also as Europeans travel, they begin to see comets somewhere else. They try to understand what does it mean a comet, for example, observed in the south. So you have both topics intertwined, and these lead, for example, that in the 17th century and in the 18th century, when the Inquisition goes after judicial astrology, some repertorios got some partial censored, and you have some references, particularly the ones related to comets that are traditionally more connected to judicial astronomy are blocked or are heavily erased in repertorios, but the books never make it to the index, but they get corrected or censored. So both things. By the late 17th century, they're mostly about natural astrology, but in the 16th century, they're overlapping.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, thank you. I see the hand of Davide, so please.
Thank you. Sergio, it's great to finally hear you talk about almanacs. I had a question about what you said about these being used as instruments by pilots, being taken on board and having a sort of application. And it made me think about in 2 different directions. On the one hand, whether at the beginning you were talking about portolans as records of navigational experiences. So do we have any evidence of records from navigation or the experience of pilots feeding back into the work of compiling these later almanacs? And then about the instruments themselves, the instruments of navigation, was there any awareness of the local changes to those? For example, the fact that the brass would, might change, expand, or contract based on temperature, in the same way that you mentioned bodies were understood to be changing according to location.
Okay, this is a great set of questions. I'm glad. Thanks for those questions. So on the first case, it's very interesting. On the case of navigation feeding back, because the place in the end, the first important repertorio, I think, produced by a cosmographer is the Sancho Zelaya one. He's a mathematician, but he travels to the New World significantly because he sent as a physician to the court of Inquisition, and he settled some cases in Panama, and he makes some observations about traveling, and that's why he's very interested when he's back in producing a repertorio that reflects, I think, the challenges of calculating latitudes in different locations. So I think that in the end, he's not a pilot and he doesn't have sophisticated navigational knowledge in the sense of the knowledge of navigation as a proper knowledge of a pilot, but he's been navigating, and there's an important aspect here is like many of these in astronomical instruments that are supposed to be used on board are unusable on board. Try to use an astrolabe, on a ship in motion, like the difference, the motion can make a little different in degrees that make the calculations completely unusable. So that means that these instruments are mostly used when they go down in a little island, when they stop here. And when they go down, I try to calculate the latitude, for example. They also try to make sense of what is around. And that's why repertorios are important. And I presented a photo of one that is in the British Library that shows that a pilot was using it. And he's as interested that in the table of longitudes and calculation as in some meteorological aspects. And I suspect this has to do with the fact that as soon as they were trying to set latitude, they were also trying to understand where they were at the moment, what can they eat, how humidity was there. So I think that's one case. But in the other two cases, both in the case of Jerónimo de Chávez and Rodrigo Zamorano, they were both pilot major of the House of Trade. So a lot of the information they put in repertorios is part of the circle of nautical information coming to the House of Trade, sometimes first hand, sometimes second hand. But navigation is a source of information absolutely necessary for them, and it's not an accident that the most important repertories are produced by people who are cosmographers, but also major pilots in the House of Trade. Concerning the change, for example, of instruments, Portuguese, particularly repertorios, are particularly interested in instruments, and they provide varieties in the use of materials in case you don't have, for example, one material that can be shaped in a certain way. So they provide alternatives on that, for example, in constructing sundials, in particularly hot weathers, that the heat can modify the alignment by melting the material. So there are some indication of the material aspects of instruments in repertorios that include information, because they are aware that the materials are not available everywhere. Even Sancho Zelaya 1546 already makes gives alternatives when building, for example, Jacob stuff.
Thank you very much. Stefano?
Yes, hi. Hi. So I also agree that this was a very rich topic, and I think, like last week, it's nice to actually reflect on the epistemic tools of a vast genre. So it gives us an opportunity to consider continuities from the 15th century onward and so on. And I just think among the things you did well, you presented cases of people in Seville or Salamanca who were clearly interested in reconstructing this knowledge based on Sacro Bosco and making a sort of mathematization in the presentation of these things, which it technically goes back to the visual aspects as well, the use of layers, in the diagrams and so on. So I want to push that in two ways. One is that I think that how much of this knowledge was actually driven by printers rather than by cosmographers or authors? In other words, are printers developing this successful genre because they see a niche in the market? And I say this because I think that in the studies of this Ibero-American almanacs, it seems like authorial intentions are in the question of mestizo knowledge and indigenous knowledge is occupying everything. But in fact, it's also a case study of printing. And so the areas that pushed through that. And then the other way to push back is also related to the construction of universalism. So how much of this repertorios co-opt or exploit, I don't know what's the right word, the idea that in Spain at that moment, there is this idea that the monarchy, the Catholic monarchy is the end of time. So it's almost like, there is a providential aspect that everything is fixed by that, and it gives a new universal history of redemption. And so the local knowledge is either alternative to that, or it finds meaning because of this universal narrative. And so if you can elaborate on that aspect as well.
Stefano, great question. Thank you so much. On the first, I think you're absolutely right. The printers are initially the ones pushing the development of the genre, and it's a printer who looks for Andres Deli and say, can you enrich this granulax to make it more marketable? What can we do to sell it better? And then he provides the first set of editions. But the problem is that everyone begins to put all kind of information, and the genre becomes a bit of a mess. And this is what in 1520 Sanchez Zavalla tries to mend, not only by recalculating and correcting the information, but also, and this is an important aspect I just passed by, asking for a printing license to protect the contents. So as the genre evolves and the industry of the books also, there's an attempt to protect this content and say, okay, at least this kind of repertorios require a printing license and then should be sanctioned and etc. So the history of the book goes with that very, very, I think, hand by hand, and including, for example, the development of the visual language. So when you check in the terrain, like different copies, there is a main line, which I think is the most epistemologically significant, which is the one going through the cosmographers. And then, what Jerónimo de Chávez does in 1548, that is an attempt to organize all the literature on time, not only on prognostication or prognosis, but also on enchiridions that are becoming popular in the first part of the century. I didn't mention those, but all the chronologies that are beginning to emerge, he also puts them together and tries to organize time back and forth in a line that starts with the creation and ends with the Last Judgment. And a very important step is 1492, Spanish discoveries of the Americas, as a major step in the Christianization of the world towards, and this begins to go to the second question, and the fulfilling of the universal Christendom. So in a sense, but also around this, you find all kind of little repertorios that are developed by printers, and those repertorios have an impact on the practice. I mean, some of the ones smuggled to the Americas are these, that are reproduced, trying to avoid the imperial license that is very, very restrictive. So the genre is exhibit, I think, the patterns classic of this kind of ephemeral literature, even if the book becomes thicker and is around 500 folios in the end. It keeps exhibiting the pattern of a high demand material. And then you find the printers involved there, but also you find cosmographers trying to put some order and organizing this enterprise. And these are basically the cases of Chavez and Zamorano and others minor figures in the 1580s. And so I think that's an aspect. The other one is that the reorganization of time, and this is an aspect is very important for my research as well. It has to do with the chronologies and how, by providing a timeline and organizing and synchronizing events of different chronologies, and they go to Egyptian chronologies, the Vulgata and all Hebrew, and organize in an attempt to produce the astronomical chronology, the events, organizing the Christianization of the world. And that in the New World becomes the chance to introduce even prehistoric chronologies into this universal Christendom, not only done by missionaries and priests, but also by elites, by local indigenous elites who want to involve and become part of this chronology of the world, showing that they descend from this tribe of Israel, for example, or that the history is a bit like the history before Christ, that they didn't know Christ, but they shouldn't be condemned because of this. So you kind of find all kind of chronological tools also to advance in this political religious program of the Spanish crown, but also Spanish intellectuals and counter-reform intellectuals to do a universal Christendom.
Thank you. Thank you so much. If there is no other question, I would like to ask myself a question, and then Barbara, because I would like to follow what Sergio just said about universal chronology. In the last section of your paper called American Integration, you mentioned also how the almanacs included the topic of the pre-Hispanic pasts and the genealogy of the Aztec kings. And I'm interested in this moment, to what extent they included this genealogy to what you have just mentioned, to the sort of parallel histories or parallel chronologies of the Aztecs, let's say, and European history in connection with the astrological history and astrological chronology of the world. How they use this Aztec genealogy to create a complex universal chronology, let's say.
That's a great question, Vladimir. Thank you so much. I think I'm going to show you quickly in some slides here. Like this is a Chavez 1548 table of chronology that we see on the left-hand side, and we see initially the calculation of astronomical chronology, the years of Christ as he recalculated them, and then we have a number of events, and then we have emperors of Rome, how many years and months they ruled, and then we have a list of significant events that occur there. As the genre evolved, they're more complex chronologies. Chronologies involve different countings, for example, the Egyptian, etc. I'm going to jump quickly. This is a bit like the example, and he even talks a bit about how time works. When this comes to the Americas, there are different ways to reappraise these, and it all depends. Almanacs, especially in the Americas, are complex, very religious and political tools, and they're produced normally by elites with very, very precise interest. So we have two examples here. One that is the case of the Codex Mexicano that is produced around 1580 in Mexico City at the time. And we find there, this is a genealogy of Aztec kings. This is a fascinating almanac because it's all produced in the Aztec pictorial system. So it looks like just pictorial system, but when you go over the section, it follows the section of a repertorio, the topics. I'll show you another image in a second. And then we find the genealogy that is from left to right as a genealogical tree. And then you find a red line that is the royal line, connected the royal blood. That means to think the direct descendants from God. And the second one, that means the right to rule. By one of the last layers, it intersects via marriages with conquistadors. And this is an attempt, a genealogical use of history to try to assert the right to rule. But also we find this vertical division of time that is made according to the Aztec calendar, that is by the time synchronized with the European calendar. I'll show you an image of that is here. And this image shows, for example, that this is a set of Dominical letters, and the key to read it is St. Paul's Foundation Jesuit school, which is 1575. This gives a key to this calendar wheel that is synchronized with the one on the right-hand side that depicts the 4 principles of the Aztec calendars and all the lunar days on the hand right side. So in the end, they are synchronized. And for example, in this calendar, we find a full synchronization or an attempt to synchronize really the Christian calendar with the Aztec calendar. And this goes back and forth for the chronologies also, establishing, for example, some comets that were seen before the arrival of the Spaniards at an event that serves to show that the chronology is done rightly, that they are coincident in the calculation of time. So this is a very significant aspect. The other one that is very famous, that I only put an image here, is the one on the right-hand side that is made in Peru by Bomán Poma. That is very, very famous because it includes the ages of the Inca people before the arrival of the Spaniards. And the chronology is made astronomically, using eclipses as they are presented in Chávez Repertorio. So he used them back and synchronized with local record of chronologies and decides what is important to be included in this chronology. The effect in the end is linear stories that can be synchronized, and you can see what is happening in Peru, for example, before the arrival of the Spaniards, with the table of Roman emperors, for example. So this gives an impression of a history running at the same time.
Excellent. Thank you so much. I would like to learn more about great conjunctions as well, and their influence on in parallel or in analogical way on Aztec history and let's say European history. But now, Barbara, is your turn.
Thank you very much indeed. Sergio, this was great. I just have 2 very small comments. I mean, and then 3 questions, but I hope brief questions. The comment is just the importance of this political aspect, and thank you for showing this. I mean, it's of course important in the case of imperial, let's say, geography and cosmography, but I think this is also quite relevant to European, to continental aspect in different times of how politics influence also the contents of almanacs. The other one is that this local and global aspects are like the repertorios are a beautiful example of that, and you've made it very strong in your presentations and very lucid. So my 3 questions are about, first one's about the audience of almanacs, of repertorios as well, meaning, is there any differentiation between the audiences? You mentioned a few times about this amalgamate, let's say, of information that is contained in the repertorios. So is there anything throughout the time, I imagine, that differentiates the types of readership and then the types of content that is provided, like in 2 separate, let's say, publications aimed at 2 different audiences? The second question is whether are there any star authors of repertorios at any time? I mean, somebody who is explicitly eminent in the market because, for example, of the content that is individualized or particularly interesting for particular readers. And the third one is, I imagine that it might be a bit later than what you've shown us, but not necessarily, especially with the development of print and throughout 17th, 18th centuries. In the South American, Ibero-American market, do we have a situation that there are repertorios, local almanacs, at the same time functioning with, for example, almanacs that are brought by European tradesmen or, well, let's say, political agents of some sort? That means that they function in the market for different, again, types of readers, but there is a possibility of their intermingling and resourcing one another. Thank you.
Well, great questions, Barbara. Wonderful. Thank you so, so much for that. About the first is a great question. I think the audience evolves. I mean, in principle, these almanacs are for everyone who may use tables, and it's very undefined. But as you track the genre, I think the first users are physicians, not very educated physicians, you know, sometimes very educated ones, but sometimes not very educated ones. And you notice that some of the visual elements are directed to for them to be able to locate and interpret signs in a way that doesn't imply reading much. For example, in Sancho Zalaya, who is a physician, um, he even explained what a number is, not in a theoretical way, but he says a number is a unit and is represented this way, and there's a one. And then if you put another one, there's a two. And then he explained how to count. And in a sense, it's a basic treatise on arithmetic, but on practical arithmetic, for example, to produce counting. And similarly, he explained very basic elements like what a circle is and things that then he uses, for example, to explain instruments. So initially, we have what I think is a growing audience of probably or mostly physicians, but just a couple of hours before I found a couple of beautiful references of friars this is around 1530s. And when describing, for example, some of the Aztec system, he compared the Aztec system with the repertorios, and he says, this is what in our repertorios we do this way. And our agricultural people, when you use repertorios, does this, and Aztecs do that. And so another significant source of users is agricultural people planting, people harvesting, people farming, because it's the people who need to understand the cycles of the moon that is very, very related to agriculture. So that's another significant one. And a third one, it's a priest concerned with calendrics. That's a third group that is educated, that knows Latin, that knows some mathematics, that some know computational astronomy sometimes, and they go to the New World and they establish calendars according to the latitude. They want to make sure that they celebrate Easter in the right moment, not to be confused with the Jewish Passover, not to be taken in the wrong way. So that's an important aspect that by the end of the century becomes. So I think these are the three initial users, but then pilots, which are interested in all of this stuff, become, I think, a fourth set of users. As the genre evolved by the end of the century, repertories are really sophisticated in terms of length, theoretical context, mathematical elaborations, and as I show you, they even include theorica planetarium that are very, very sophisticated devices of calculation that initially you don't associate with astrological observation in principle. Quickly, there are three stars about your second question. The first is Andrés de Lee. This is spread all over Europe. It's a bestseller from 1485. It's best-selling until 1575, and then Chavez in 1548 produces another one that becomes a bestseller until the Gregorian Reform of 1580s. Then we have Zamorano that becomes a star until the end of the genre in the 17th century. I keep being reprinted and reused. At least the last version he does is 1621. And then it goes in the hands of the Jesuits who reproduce it in the Imperial College of Madrid. And the third one about the South American one, there are two fates of the South American knowledge in this story. A lot of the knowledge of the South of the Americas, and particularly South America, is taken by people who feeds this knowledge back into Europe, and it appears in Iberian repertorios. So a lot of information we get in Iberian repertorios is actually information of plants, animals, location, climates from South American observation that is fed into the Iberian Peninsula and appears in repertorios that are taken back. So that's a form of circulation. But also there are local productions that are all of them in manuscript in the 15th and 16th, in the 16th century and in the 17th century that try to adapt some of this knowledge into local circumstances. So you have America present in both ways, in the big printed repertorios that are fed through this way. Some of these pilots travel, come and include information, and not that they do botanical research. They go and ask indigenous what this plant is, how does this heal, how is it called, And this is what appears later in repertories and local production for very, usually very politically loaded circumstances.
Great, thank you.
Thank you very much. I think we have to stop here. I would like to continue our discussion, but it's already 5:52. So thank you once again for, thanks especially to Sergio for his very rich and very inspiring paper. Thank you for participating, asking questions, and you are very much welcome to come again next week on Monday. We will have Thomas Vozar as our third speaker next week. I don't remember the exact title of his presentation. Perhaps Stefano can help me at this moment if you have the program. You are muted, Stefano.
Sorry about that. So the presentation of Thomas is entitled "The Dragoman and the Scholar, Ali Ufki, Isaac Barrow, and the Orientalizing Poetics of De Religione Turcica of 1658.
Thank you so much. Okay, I'm very much looking forward to see you all next week. And I'm very much looking forward to Thomas's paper. And Sergio, thank you once again very much for your today's presentation.
Thank you very much for the invitation, and thanks everyone for the assistance, and see you next week.